Okay, teachers, welcome to Diving into Literary Theory. I'm Barbara Bloomingdale, your academic tech IST for high school ELA.
And I'm Tony Perez, high school ELA IST. I think that's the end of my title.
I
Yeah.
think that's it. All
Okay.
right. And we're going to do a little dive into literary theory, just like the title suggests. And we're going to talk about how you can use literary criticism in the classroom to help your students really dig deep into the text and think about the literature that you're reading from some different lenses and some different perspectives. So we're going to start with this quote from Chinua Achebe, the author of Things Fall Apart. And he says, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter."
Yeah, I love that quote. I think about books that I've read over time, or even movies that I've seen when I was younger till now, and how my perspective changes, and I'm still, more or less the same person, right? So you have to think that a really good text or a movie allows for different people to come at it from different points of view. And then the characters in there, right? If you kind of try to take their perspectives in mind other than the main character, you're going to start seeing different points of view or different things kind of come at you. So yeah, this quote makes me think about how that just happens naturally with us as readers. And we want to kind of train our kids to be thinking like that all the time.
I know that the idea of teaching literary theory to high school kids can seem really daunting for teachers, but it is another, like we were saying, it is a really rich avenue for kids and for their thinking. But it's also something that we've been seeing more and more in the TEKS. So Tony, can you talk a little bit about this? Why teach literary theory in your high school classes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this teak here, 6D, is probably the biggest or the backbone teak for the literature section of teaks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in this one, a couple of things change when you get to English 4. One is the word evaluates there instead of analyze. So, it's a little bit higher level of thinking for kids. They're starting to make some choices, not just see what the
Mm-hmm.
writer's doing. And
Good
then,
distinction.
yeah, and then we start seeing the words historical, social, and economics context come into the TEKS language, and it's not there at 1 and 2. It's kind of there at 3, but it's like at the forefront at English 4. And so if you think about what some of the lenses kind of get you to, they kind of get you to look at these things naturally and ask questions about things about history, social, economic context. And so I think in our mind, this is kind of a perfect vehicle to get to some of the stuff in the text that might be a little bit more sophisticated for our older readers. And also, like you were saying earlier, some of our best conversations have come out of that.
So when we're thinking about these different critical theories, right? Or as Deborah Appleman calls them, the different lenses, which ones work best with students? And when we were talking about this, we really felt like there were 4 that were the most kid-friendly, that were the probably the easiest for kids to wrap their head around and sort of consider. And I think especially these 2, considering a lot of the conversations that we've been having about current events and pop culture and even historical events that are really impactful right now in the last couple of years in the conversations that we've been having, just about everything, right, about our world. So the first one is gender, and this is a really easy one I think we're all familiar with. How does the text challenge, confirm, or reinforce our understanding of gender roles?
Mm-hmm.
The second is class or social power. How does the text comment on or represent social and economic classes?
Mm-hmm.
The next ones are psychological and historical. So what do the characters' emotions and behavior reveal about their psychological states? And how does the text reflect the period in which it's written?
Oh, real quick, guys, these are also the 4 lenses that are on the summative. So the summative is a cold read text, Barbecue by Sandra Cisneros, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and their task is to apply 2 of these 4 lenses to that text. So, feel free to teach other lenses if you think you have time, but these also align to the summative in case you're wondering. Yep. And I think, I just want to point out that you might be using, or you might have used different language for these in the past. Like you might
Mm-hmm.
have called gender feminist, or you might have called the social Marxist. And obviously those terms are also correct, but we're just trying to use kind of the most kid-friendly terms. For us, it's less about whether or not they know these terms. It's more about just using these questions and these lenses as a way to kind of get into the text and view it differently, right? Like the text didn't say they need to know Marxist theory. It just said, can they evaluate the social, economic, and historical context of a text. So let's try not to get caught up too much in the names
Terminology.
here, the terminologies here, right? And kind of just go with what's going to make sense to kids.
And especially too, I think it's okay for us to acknowledge that we're living in a very politically charged time. And I think some of that language may be off-putting to kids or to their families. We are certainly not teaching Marxist theory in English class. We're really just thinking about class and social power. And so again, to Tony's point, we can let go of some of the terminology as long as we are getting to the concept and really thinking about the content in that way. So the other thing to know is that infographic that you're seeing on the right side of the screen is also a resource that is available to you. And this is in your unit resources right now. You're welcome to use this with your students. We've actually used this with classes before. And I know Patricia Hasso at Health Careers and Kenny Van Eimerman, we've used those with their 9th grade students. And so your seniors, I think, are really going to get into this. So a really good example of this is the different interpretations that we've seen from artists, from writers of the Disney princess stories. And Emily Swoboda researched these, found these for us, and I think these are really interesting pieces that you can use to talk about lenses with your students. So this is the typical representation of Snow White, the original that we see in the Disney films. And of course, she has her porcelain skin and her rosy complexion and the jet black hair, and she's very beautiful and very traditionally feminine, and she has the very sweet bird on her finger that is singing to her and talking to her. And I think does it help her with her chores even, right? So she's got all of these classic Disney qualities to her. And here's a version of Snow White as reimagined by the artist Dina Goldstein. And I think this one is fascinating for a lot of reasons and lends itself to those lens interpretations that we've been talking about. Tony, what are some of the things that you noticed when you saw this image for the first time?
Yeah, so the first thing I notice is sort of when I think about the gender lens, kind of like this role that Snow White has of probably the stereotypical housewife, tending to the babies, and the husband in there is just looks like he's just drinking beer and eating chips and watching sports or something on television, really disengaged from the family. So, a lot of gender role conversations there. I think, if we look at her face, we might be able to do some psychological analysis on her. What is she thinking? What's going through her mind?
Mm-hmm.
This kind of really flat look, impression,
Right,
blank,
this
almost
bizarre expression on her face.
Yeah. So I think you could do an interesting reading on that. And then one of the other things that jumps out to me is like, what time period is this? Barbara, you were saying earlier, this is probably a 90s television, right?
Yeah, that TV reminds me of the one I had in the 90s.
Okay, yeah, and then in the background we have kind of wooden paneling and the fireplace that to me screams 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have these chairs and the frame for the picture kind of, I think you said Baroque. I really like that term earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but very kind of old-fashioned, and they're all mixed together. So you might be able to say something about how what works is faded over time, and they're still trying to hold on to the past, even though they're clearly in a different time period.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you could probably do a social class thing reading here. This isn't the kingdom. This isn't the castle. This isn't like a lavish house or castle or anything like that, right?
No servants, right? No
No,
glamour, no glitz, no.
very middle class kind of
Mm-hmm.
house. And so I think all the lenses kind of apply here. If you give, if you kind of take them one by one and think through this piece. So it's a really complicated piece with a lot going on. But I think we can all say that maybe things didn't end up so Happily ever after for Snow White and the Prince.
Yeah, absolutely. The honeymoon is literally over. He even has a hole in his tights.
Oh
And
yeah.
I thought the image of him barefoot was just really strange for some reason. And we also have some words from the artist. Dina Goldstein says Snow White is trapped in domestic hell.
Mm,
This is the only picture where the prince is present. I'm sorry, in her collection, where the prince is present, but his presence is really a non-presence. And the photo raises a lot of questions about society's expectations as to how women should lead their lives. And I think there's a lot of really rich conversations that you could have with kids around this representation of Snow White.
yeah. Like no one's looking at the kids. Neither parent is, and it's clear that
Mm-hmm.
they want some attention.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah. Hell, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe now her eyes are screaming, "Get me out of here!" Now that you say
Yeah, absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. Here's another representation. And I think this one is a little bit more a blend of the sort of classic Snow White image, right?
Yeah, she's definitely still kind of has the same hair, and she's got the same kind of skin, rosy, kind of happy expression that we saw with the bird.
Little
Um,
updated outfit, right? She's got high heels and a pencil skirt. She looks a little bit more professional woman.
Definitely. But yeah, so like, I feel a little weird saying this as a dude, but it seems like she's got the best of both worlds. She's still like very feminine and beautiful, but also has a career. Um, Clearly a professional here, successful.
Hmm.
So maybe that's a celebration of women, but maybe also puts pressure on women at the same time. I don't know.
To
What's your?
try to be, yeah, to try to be both, right?
Mhm.
And it's interesting because this is from a collection by an artist who was asked to reimagine the Disney princesses as modern professional women,
Mhm.
and I think it really speaks to that. And so yeah, I mean, it's that conflict that all professional women, adult professional women, wrestle with, the like I can have it all
Mhm.
versus the do I really want to, and is that really possible to balance all of those things. Like we're only seeing Snow White in a professional context here, whereas we were only seeing Snow White in the last image in a personal context,
Mhm.
right? Because she's not anything outside of just being a mom and a housewife.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of really rich conversations we could have about this one. And I think very impactful that this is the image or the vision of a male artist. So again, a lot of conversations I think you could have with kids about how this is being reimagined specifically by a male artist, by a man.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of resources that we have for you that I think can help you with these conversations with your kids. And again, we're sort of sticking with our Disney theme here. But we've got 4 different ed puzzles that you can use with your students, and all of these are linked to the unit resource pages. You can look at gender lenses in Tangled, class and social power lenses in The Princess and the Frog, psychological lens in Frozen, and the historical lens in Moana. So all of these are available to you, and then the questions for analysis are already set up there as well.
So another resource we have for you are texts, and these are texts that we either got from the textbook or texts that we've had success teaching in the classroom that we feel like apply to the lenses. And if we thought it applied to more than one lens, we put it in more than one section. And we just kind of had some general questions from Appleman, and then also
Mhm.
from just us teaching in the classroom that we thought might be helpful for these texts. We do have a couple here with asterisks because there is some with a little bit more mature content. So you just want to read through these before you teach them and make sure you're comfortable teaching them with your students, especially in this kind of virtual setting. I can just say that, the ones that I've used in the classroom have all been really successful and had great conversations with my students about these things.
Mhm. And they were certainly fun to read, but to your point about the mature content, I think these would be good to offer as choices and maybe not necessarily as a whole class read
That's a good point.
just again right now in this environment, because if you're reading something with really mature content but you don't feel like you've set up a very safe, inclusive classroom, your kids may be feeling more comfortable opting for a different piece instead. Some of the ways that you can approach this with your students include using this really interesting graphic organizer by Deborah Appleman, and she calls it Shifting Perspectives. And what she asks kids to do here is, number one, to consider the story from the protagonist point of view. And then secondly, to then take the other important characters in the text and think about the text and the story from their point of view instead. And then consider what stands out when we think about those two perspectives, when we shift it to a person who is not necessarily the center of the text. What are some of the things that emerge from that consideration? Tony, what are some other ways that you've done this with your students?
Yeah, good question. So I've done it a couple different ways. One way is like if we're reading a text whole class. I had a lot of success with Metamorphosis with this, and also Raisin in the Sun. And when you and I were talking about Great Gatsby right before we started recording, that kind of lends itself well. But most works like that are a little bit longer have a lot of meat to them and are really complex. And so kind of as we're teaching content and all the other things, apply the lenses to them. And then after they kind of learn the lenses with the whole group text, then I'll give them some short stories to experiment with afterwards once they've learned the lenses. Another way I've done it is read the short group of short stories together as a class first for like character and theme and those kinds of things, and then give them the lenses afterwards in group work and kind of play with them there. So they already know the story, right? They're familiar with it. It's not completely cold. And now they're just applying this a little bit more rigorous task by looking at these specific things or looking at from this specific viewpoint.
Right. And I think A Raisin in the Sun is one of my real favorites. I absolutely love that play. And I think that one is such, both of the texts that you mentioned are so rich with possibilities, because one of the first questions that I would ask my kids is, who really is the protagonist of A Raisin in the Sun? Is it Mama? Is it Walter? Who is the real main character here? And then if we were looking at that story from another character's point of view, there's a huge difference between what Mama would say, what Benita would say, what Ruth would say. Even though they are all women, they all give us a different representation of who women can be in the text. They've all made very different choices in their lives. They all represent something very different about that sort of female voice in the text.
Yeah, what I love about that text, to your point, is we're always worried about the danger of the single story, and that text, because there's so many rich female characters in there, it makes sure that doesn't happen, because we get definitely more than one story, more than one viewpoint. So yeah, that's a really good example, Barbara, of a text that you can do this with and have a lot of good conversation around.
Yeah, absolutely. And, now that you say that, it also occurs to me lots of different representations of men, right? Because there's Walter, but there's also Asagai, and then there's also the other character that Benita is dating. I can't remember his name.
Oh,
George.
yeah. George. Yeah.
So there's all these different representations of men that the son also sees throughout the narrative as well, which I think is really interesting. Love that play. Okay, so just in closing, some words of wisdom from Deborah Appleman, who is really the pioneer in teaching critical theory to students. And what she says is that the way that we read is a choice. The interpretation of the text depends on active, conscious decisions on the part of the reader. So here are some hints to remember when you're thinking about the critical lenses. Number one, they're not always mutually exclusive. I think a really good example of that is the Edpuzzle exercise that we made on Moana, but also the Edpuzzle about Tangled. And as we were talking about it, Tony, we were realizing that Moana is more than just the historical lens. I think it lends itself to a really rich conversations about gender.
Absolutely. And a lot of these things just kind of go under the power thing naturally, because whenever you're talking about gender roles, you're talking about a struggle of power between the genders. So yeah, like I just think it's helpful to let kids say, oh yeah, it could be this and this. And I think that's actually a more complex and rich conversation anyways than say, oh, it has to be gender, or it has to be social class. So yeah, but the Moana example is a really good one to illustrate that for kids.
Yeah, we can't just say there's only one way to read a text. There's lots of multiple ways that we can explore those interpretations. She says, number 2, no single lens gives the clearest view, and they all have limitations, which I think speaks to the point that we just made a moment ago. Number 3, it's easier for novices to apply one lens at a time. And Tony, did you find this to be true with your students?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of like if you ever started trying new cuisine or something and you want to like just one flavor at a time, like you want to know what ketchup tastes like before you add the mayo and the mustard, right? It's kind of the same concept with this. Like, I think kids are going to get to the idea naturally that the lenses aren't mutually exclusive, that first point. But the only way for them to do it is to really kind of play with one thing at a time. It just makes sense to wrestle with one new idea at a time so they can learn it more deeply.
And then finally, writing about literature and art affords us the ability to discuss real ideas in the realm of imagination. In other words, we can play. And I love that this is sort of her final word of wisdom here, that because it goes back to that point that literature and art are a way for us to explore ideas and possibilities and concepts in text that we can't literally do in real life. We don't have the option to just go back and do over and try something a different way, but we can think that through in literature, in art, and in our conversations about texts.
Yeah, and this is a really safe place to have these really serious conversations that we want to have about maybe current events in our world, but that stuff maybe gets too political. And here it's art, right? It's fiction, so it's a much safer place to have those conversations. Real quick, you may have noticed on the text that not many of them or any of them were British authors, and that's okay, because in the last unit you satisfied the Brit Lit text for the year if you read, some pieces from the British canon already. So feel free to read kind of whatever text you think is going to work with your kids. You don't have to stick to Brit Lit in this unit.
Great. Thank you for that, Tony. And teachers, we hope you found this helpful. We'd love to talk to you about this if you have any questions or any comments for us about teaching critical lenses with your students. Go for it.
All right. So Barbara and I really like this quote.
You know what? You're doing a good job.
No,
I was supposed to read the quote. Dang it. Yay, we've got our blooper reel already.
Woo!